Greetings, everyone, and welcome again to another edition of Classrooms Without Walls. I'm your host, Brother Salim, and we are continuing with how structural racism shaped the prison industrial complex. Before we begin, be mindful that Philly's unseated city councilman Obono has introduced a bill explaining, challenging, and designed to uproot structural racism here in Philadelphia. But the impact of this bill will be felt nationwide. Check them out every week on WURD, Word Radio, and every Thursday at City Council. That's Obama Higgins. Before we begin this week, attached to last week's conversation, we want everybody to understand that we are at war, and ignorance is the enemy. And because we don't know, and the things we don't know about, we are being phased out of urban America by mass gentrification. We are being phased out of the economy through a lack of skills that fit in today's economy. Our value as a people has been artfully planned as prison inmates. And without a consistent and generational rites of passage, our youth are blind to what a worthy example looks like and how they should become examples instead of casket dwellers. Now, prison plays a part in all that. And as we said last week, none of this is an accident. It's all planned. It's like you have Planned Parenthood, well, we have planned prisons. And the information presented this week is not just a theory of conspiracy, but it is a conspiracy in fact. A conspiracy of structural racism that leaves no American institution with clean hands. None of them. They're all intertwined. So let's start with government and the presidential role in this structural racism. Specifically, we can go back to President Nixon. Now we can go back to Washington and talk about structural racism all the way back during slavery. But to bring things closer or up to speed, we're going to start with Nixon. Then we'll proceed to Reagan, and then we'll end with Clinton. This mass incarceration, the ideal of it began on June 17th, 1971, when President Richard Nixon called for a war on drugs, for increasing sentence and enforcement actions for low-level drug offenses. The American government created a crisis of mass incarceration. Here's the opinion of one of them at that time. And this is Nixon's chief of domestic policy. Now, mind you, these people who serve under these presidents, they're not voted into office. They're somebody that we don't know, we've never heard of, we don't know where they come from or where they live, but they become the policy makers. Now, here's what Ehrlichman said in an interview. He said, the Nixon campaign in 1968 and the Nixon White House after that had two enemies. One, the anti-war left, and two, Black people. And Ehrlichman went on to say, he said, you understand what I'm saying? We knew we couldn't make it illegal to be either against the war or blacks. But by getting the public to associate the hippies with marijuana and blacks with heroin, and then criminalizing both of them heavily, we could disrupt these communities. We could arrest their leaders, raid their homes, break up their meetings, and vilify them night after night on the evening news. Did we know we were lying about the drugs? Of course we did. Now, at the same time, in urban communities, here's what they were promoting. While the president is talking about a war on drugs, here's what they were promoting in the urban communities. Superfly, with a guy called Ron O'Neal, supposed to be a black drug dealer, and they popularized that. They had him in his platform shoes, his big hat, big brim hat, riding around in his Cadillac, and a big drug seller. Not realizing, or of course they realized, but we didn't realize that if you're a drug dealer bringing in major weight, you are sentencing you, Mr. Drug Dealer, you are sentencing thousands, hundreds of thousands, or millions of people to their death. Another writer characterized the war on drugs as like this. He said, drugs can't surrender. Nixon declared war against an enemy incapable of organized surrender. There is no end game. The drug war is by definition a forever war. Now, we see the effects of what was declared in 1971 have an effect on us today. Now, also in 1971 or in the 70s, the US Congress began to pass laws calling for stiffer sentences. And in the state government, they changed the laws. There was a law on the state books, so to speak, that they wrote in 1939 that defined murder as two types: first degree murder and all other murders. Well, first degree murder was defined, and the sentencing for first degree murder was death or life imprisonment. And then they went on to say that all other murders are second degree. And the sentence for all other murders was 10 to 20 maximum. Well, in the 70s, they changed that. They changed that to read first degree is death or life, second degree is life, and third degree is a maximum of 40 years, which means now that you've declared a war on drugs, which is really a war on the urban cities, and you have you're criminalizing their acts as opposed to what they're doing now. They're saying these people are sick and they need hospital care as opposed to needing prison. Well, then they were sending the majority of the people who were blacks to prison. And by giving them longer sentences, you can keep them for a longer period of time. Therefore, you're making upwards of 100,000 per person. Because when you start off, like now, the average money spent on a person in prison is 45,000 a year per year. But the older that person get, the more expensive they become as they develop physical issues, as they develop mental issues. So you might end up paying 100 or 150,000 per year per person the longer you keep them in jail. But this is what was going on in the 70s while we were busy playing the part of Superfly. So the prison population began to grow in the 70s, with politicians from both parties use fear and thinly veiled racial rhetoric to push increasingly punitive policies. if the prison population, or I would say the crime was going down, why do you need more prisons? Why do you need more punitive policies? That is to keep people in line and keep people waiting in line to be the next prison inmate. And that's what they were doing. All of these things were put together. You know, there's an economic part to it also, but we're talking about what these particular presidents did to set this war on drugs in motion. Then in the 80s, Reagan came into office. At the time of his presidency, when he came in office, the prison population was 330,000. By the time he left office 8 years later, the prison population had nearly doubled to 630,000. To let you know how policies and racially motivated policies were shaping the prison landscape. And it's still affecting us to today, because when you send somebody to prison for life, you X them out of their community, you X them out of their families, you X them out of society altogether. For all intents and purposes, they are dead to society. And because there are people who were sentenced in the 70s who are still serving time, this is still affecting their families. They're still here, but they're still incarcerated, and they're still being affected by these racist policies that were put in place 30, 40, and 50 years ago. But let's cut to the chase. Let's cut to the real culprit. Back in the 90s, when Bill Clinton was running for presidency, he took a book out of the Republicans, a page out of the Republicans' playbook. When really, the reality is they're both the same party. Because if you say you're for America, but you have more loyalty to one party as opposed to the other, well, then who's for America? If you're for Republicans and this other guy's for Democrats, who's for America? But anyway, he took a page out of them because they were always known and still are known as the guys that are always tough on crime, put out tough policies. And the Democrats were always seen as soft on crime. So Clinton said, well, I'm going to do what they do, since most of the time it's them that's getting elected. And he began to push the Democrats to be tough on crime. And as soon as he was elected, he passed the 1994 crime bill into law. And the crime bill incentivized, funded, and rewarded states that, number one, increased the length of incarceration of those convicted of violent crimes. They awarded 12.5 billion in grant money to states who agreed to perpetuate policies that translated to bloated prisons. Now, bloated prisons means this. You pack the prisons and then you start complaining about we need to build more prisons. You have several riots, like they had the Camp Hill riot, and that's no accident also, because a rebellion is when sound-minded people get together and decide they've had enough, and they begin to put forth a list of demands. But a riot is when a spark has but to be involved, because when the state police come in, they don't say, were you involved in the riot, or were you in your cell, were you sitting this thing out? No, they come in with dogs, cuffs, um, batons or batons, and they beat everybody down to a pulp. They have everybody laying on their face down, stripped naked on the ground in the mud, and handcuffed to one another. So there's a big difference between a riot and a rebellion. So Clinton eventually locked up more people which means more black people than any president in the history of the United States. Listen to what I'm saying. He locked up more black men than any president in the history of the United States, because prior to the 1900s or prior to the beginning of the last century, black men didn't go to prison. But the number that he locked up exceeds all of those black men who ever been locked up in America. So while we were sitting there touting him as black, and because he could play the saxophone, on and on and on, he was a man that was taking a page out of the Republican book just to get elected, as well as to get re-elected. Meanwhile, all of those people that were used and abused and put in there to become the new prison crowd, they're still there. And when they come, they don't have a voice. And when anybody tries to speak for them, they try to steer them to a certain language. They try to steer them to, oh, I'm sorry, boss, I won't do it no more. But they never talk about how did these prisons come to be to begin with. Because if you go back, now listen to this, I'm not going to take it for granted that everybody knows. Maybe. I know there's a lot of people that know more than I know. I don't have their names, but I give them their due because a lot of them mentored me. But if you go back at the end of World War II, now follow me now, you just got finished fighting, liberating Germany and fighting against the Japanese, World War II. In the 50s, we're talking about a decade later, those two countries are your biggest economic trading partners. How? How do a person that you call your enemy and that you're at war with, that you're shooting at, become your greatest trading partner? And the people who sacrifice and the people who are living here, they get less than those people were getting and still are to this day. But those people, and they're on the boards of most of the corporations in the world. You know, they serve on these Germans and Japanese serve on these boards. But these corporations decided in the 50s, oil is king. Coal is no longer king. So we no longer need coal. But what do we do when we put our people, who are the coal miners, who are sacrificing by getting this black lung disease, who backed our war efforts, what are we going to do about them? Well, we're going to create another growth industry. We're going to create a prison growth industry. But in order to make a prison growth industry work, you have to have environments of violence. You have to have environments of poverty. You have to have environments of joblessness, because nothing stops a bullet like a job. But if you don't have no jobs available for those shooting, then what's going to stop those bullets? So they began to, well, they started off with the presidents setting the tone. We need more prisons. We need more time out of these people. We need more of these people in prison. So by the time they got to the 90s, the US government told them, listen, anybody who's promoting more time in prison, more people in prison, you're the ones who will get the money. And Pennsylvania was one of the first ones. And to this day, Pennsylvania is still the number one incarcerated state in the world. You know, so this is no accident, and this is something that was planned, like Planned Parenthood, Planned Prisonhood. That's what they planned. So now, when we get to the 80s, that was the crack era during the Reagan years, and they were putting hordes and hordes and thousands of people in jail for crack. Even later on, when President Obama had a measure passed where the disparity between crack cocaine and powder cocaine was brought more in line. I think it's like 19% difference, where before it was like 60 to 70% more time in prison if you got caught with an ounce of crack as opposed to an ounce of powder cocaine. Well, they passed that law for federal prisons, but that law did not automatically pass to state prisons, which means most of the people who got arrested for crack cocaine in the 70s and 80s, when they passed that law, it didn't affect them. And they're still in prison. They are still on parole. Their families have still been torn apart by this prison construction, because the construction first had to happen ideologically. You had to ideologically put together the need for prisons. And then you had to put together the type of environments that would foment violence, that would foment lawlessness, that would foment joblessness, that would foment lack of education in the schools. And then by the time you fomented all that, you would have no problem sending in police to arrest them and put them in court to try them, convict them, and sentence them, and send them upstate where they can make money. Or make money, you can make money off of them. Now, mind you, also, the taxpayer is the one that loses out in the end, because the taxpayer pays for all this here. I don't care how much money the corporations make off of prisons. I don't care how much money rural America makes off of prisons. However much money they make, the end result is a tax burden, and uh, the taxpayers have to foot that bill. So when you and the tax laws are about 30,000 volumes or something like that. So very few people know what's going on with taxes. You know, all they know is they go to work, come home at the end of the year, or the beginning of the next year, they begin to pay taxes. That's it. They have no clue that they're footing the bill for all of this machination that has been going on for quite some time. But we're going to get we'll do that this week. We're going to tell you a little more about second degree. In 2015, when after Pennsylvania did not want the juvenile lifers to get out, after the study said that their brains were not mature yet, after the little white kid had already gotten out in 2012, well, they began to let, because of a retroactive law that somebody had to fight in the court, they began to let the juvenile lifers out. Now, when they let them out, here's what they said about the juvenile lifers. Because their brain had not reached the age of maturation, and the age of maturation is 26, not 17. But anyway, they said because their brain had not reached that age yet, their part in the crime, they were less culpable. Now, most of them had co-defendants who were not the shooters. So when you say the shooter, for whatever reason, you can say brain immaturity, you can say whatever you want. But if you say that the shooter is less culpable, then every agreement, and America knows this, every agreement in America is based on the law of contract. You have to agree upon this, to make it a contract, and everything in America is contractual. You have to agree upon the same thing and in the same sense. Well, if I took a plea 25, 30 years ago, whether it be guilty or not guilty, and say that, okay, this person and I wanted to rob something, or wanted to burglarize something, or wanted to whatever we were doing. And as a result of that, somebody was killed, whether I shot him, whether I stabbed him, or whether I ran over with a vehicle, it doesn't matter. That's what they call a felony homicide. And all parties are equally guilty. Thus, the agreement that I go into at 25, 30 years ago. But now, 25 years later, if you say that an individual inside of that agreement is less culpable, what would that make me? More culpable? I'm not the shooter. Maybe I was the driver. Maybe I was waiting outside, and I couldn't read this individual's mind. But if this individual's mind is less culpable, that should automatically make me the non-shooter less culpable. So there are about 2,000, at least 2,000 people still in jail under these circumstances. They were not the shooter. Their co-defendant has gotten out because of immaturation of the brain, and they're still sitting in there for what? You should go back to, if you're going back to the beginning and resentencing the individuals who were the juvenile offenders, and good for them. I'm happy for them. But if you're going to let them out, you should go back to the beginning and revisit the sentencing of their co-defendants, because there was not that agreement of 25 years ago that was broken. So go back and take a look at these people who were doing second degree, and they were not the shooters. And their families should support this. Their neighbors, their friends, all of them should support this, because if you can live with somebody who has committed murder, if you can, of course they've changed. What do you think about a person who didn't commit murder? Don't you think they've changed? And how much did they need to change, other than the agreement that they want to, do a crime together? Because there's no actual blood on their hands. There's no actual waking up in the middle of the night, a nightmare, and seeing a dead person. None of that. So we should take the U.S. government, the state governments, all of them should take a look at second degree and rethink their position. So with that, if you like the content of this podcast, hit your like button, share this with your friends and family, and hit the subscribe button also. And don't forget, unseated Councilman Obama Higgins has a bill to end structural racism. Support that bill. Support this type of content that you're listening to now. And until next week, this is Brother Salim with our third edition of Classrooms Without Walls. Peace.